what's the purpose of our housing system?
Yeah.
You could say ideally, right, it's to adequately, appropriately, affordably house everybody, right? But that's not, is it? That's where we see that happening. And who is trying to make that happen, right? The purpose of the housing system is what? Maximize wealth for a small number of people. Well, everything, right? Think of every element from land to the real estate agents to everything, right? It maximizes the return. So then, when there's city-owned land, well, maximize it for what? But for one thing, right? For some revenue. And now on co-op housing and the nonprofit housing, and they're similar, private nonprofits and co-ops, the social mix. That was controversial from day one. Why? Because the private sector actors saw it as competition, that you weren't only housing poor people, okay? So in the 50s and 60s, all the social housing, okay, was public housing for low-income people. You had to pass a needs test. You had to be really, really poor to get in, okay? But of course, they didn't support that either because that's just raises taxes and whatever, right? So then these commissions I mentioned in the late 60s and early 70s said, well, this doesn't create a good place for anyone to live. What we have here creates a better place. And so it was a constant struggle for the 20 years, 20 years, 2 decades that we were building co-ops and nonprofits to keep the program there, because the constant attack was, aren't you subsidizing not high-income people, but higher-income people? And then over time, some people in that housing will become higher income naturally as they move up the ranks or something in their job. But one answer is, so what? What goes on in the rest of the city, right? The heaviest subsidized housing, again, in the country is ownership housing. And nobody tells them to move out, or how come your kids grew up and you got divorced and you have one person living in this 4-bedroom house. Someone knocking on those doors saying, what are you doing, right? You don't belong there. No, so one simply has to respond, okay. And then the other part of the response is, yes, the False Creek Co-op received a subsidy on day one and a stream of subsidies over time. And the subsidies were steep at the beginning, just like for a homeowner when you buy a house. Your mortgage is really big at the beginning and then it goes down. But who paid for most of this building? So I don't know the exact percentage, but the vast majority of the False Creek Co-op is paid for by who? People who live here, the members. Voters or complainers need to be reminded of that, okay? And that this is, and none of you walk away with a $1 million tax-free capital gain, okay? And when you leave, there's a membership committee that democratically is, assigning the unit. What could be better than that? Let's remember, all countries are slightly different in terms of the gap between rich and poor. So if you start off as a country with a small gap between rich and poor, you're going to have an easier job housing everyone, let alone other things. And so every Western and Northern European country, except for the UK and Ireland, do better than we do on the measurement of the gap between rich and poor. That's called the Gini index, Gini coefficient. They all do better than we do. The United States is worse. Out of, pick 15 countries that are sort of like Canada in Western Europe, and it's Australia, New Zealand and all that. But the other thing then is those same countries that have a smaller gap in income have higher taxes. And there's a measure of it, the percent of GDP that goes to taxes. And it's up around 45% for much of Europe, We are at 31, and we used to be about 33 or 34% of GDP. So that's a percent of GDP, and I haven't calculated recently, but it's 1% is many, many tens and tens of billions of dollars. So if we just were, collecting a bit more taxes, what do we do with $20 billion, okay? Yeah, we have ideas what to do with it, but we're not. So those countries are more than 1% higher than we are. And it shows, if you've ever been to Denmark, the seats are sort of like sofas. The free Wi-Fi and a train for you and your bike and a train with sliding glass doors for quiet if you want to read. There's no talking or phones, yeah, right? On your commute, right? And then the buses, and how do you prevent buses in rush hour from being sardine cans? I saw it. No, bus after bus after bus when you have a bus line, right? You have enough buses because we're not cattle, right? Look, we have rules about the way we ship pigs and cows, right? There's going to be so much room, but there's no rules on a Toronto transit system about how they ship humans. No, right? There's no rules. The 50% being social housing, yeah. But remember, the social housing is socially mixed housing. And then there's market housing. Rent market, rental, and some ownership, condo or some townhouse ownership. That only comes about, right, with publicly owned land. There's an opportunity, right? Whichever authority, level of government, owns it is making some decision what to do with it. And in most cases, public land is federal, provincial, and a lot of municipal is simply sold for the best price. Well, it's just a fact. The National Housing Strategy in Ottawa, this document, they promise some publicly owned federal land for housing, not necessarily social housing, but nothing's happened yet. Okay. Because then the land is owned by all different departments, and the departments have their mandate to do this or that, and that's one factor in the way. So again, how else do we get around the dilemma you're saying? Okay, poor people put in poor housing, up against the railroad tracks and all that, but through a social housing supply program. In Canada, only 4% of our national housing stock is non-market housing, co-ops, nonprofits, and public housing. 4%. In the United States is similar. Australia is similar. But in Europe, no, right? The Netherlands, 1/3 is nonprofit. Even the UK, after Margaret Thatcher sold off half. The UK used to be 1/3 council housing, public housing. It's now 18% or so. And most countries, it's 15 or 20%. There's no right percentage for any country, it's just that 4% is not enough. And that's why waiting lists are growing. And this building of about 20,000 public and then social housing units from mid-60s to the mid-90s gave us that 4%. But then we haven't built much since. A few thousand units a year, depending on the provincial government, or some nonprofits pulled together funding in some incredible way, 10 different sources of funding and all that. So just imagine if we were building 20,000 units per year, like we used to. That's not a big deal, across the whole country. That would be 80,000 units in 4 years, say the 4-year term of this government. But that did not happen. And it did not happen in the previous 4 years or the previous. There's no one solution to all these housing dilemmas, but you need, I say 30 or 40 different things. And some of it will be some kind of a speculation tax, like we're beginning to have, and regulations, taxes, but also supply incentives to do things that need to be done. Because right now we're not doing that. Who are we building for? Right? All those towers opposite us. Right? Who can afford to live in them? And the sad thing has happened also in the last 20 years or less. There's now a journal article with a great title that summarizes it. I had to pause when I saw it. This is only half a year ago. In quotation marks, not for housing, in quotation marks. So not for housing, housing. So you know what that is, yeah. So there'll be the bank vaults, there'll be empty units that somebody owns and would rather not get them dirtied up with a tenant or something. And then there's the Airbnb and all that. So we have, it used to be, and this is an article telling planners and housing researchers, well, it used to be housing was housing. You had housing, it was for somebody to live in. But now there's a whole bunch of housing stock and a whole bunch of the housing starts that are not meant for housing, not meant to be lived in. Okay, they're not for housing. So that is yet another problem that is new. The price, the value price, whatever, of the land is then determined by what's going on around in the city, what other developers got, right? And then what the owner hopes to get. Yes, it is politics and a democracy. We need to do better. See, one of the problems, though, is that in Canada, 70%, roughly 70% of Canadian households own their house. In the city, it's close to 50% in the big cities. But unless you're a recent purchaser, you're an insider as opposed to an outsider of the housing system, right? You're sitting pretty. Even if you're in a slow growth area, you own your house, and you're doing okay. And if you're in a high growth area, you're saying, oh wow, I paid this and now it's worth that. And it's a tax-free capital gain yet, okay? That's why the $6 billion a year subsidy for everybody who sells their primary residence for a capital gain, and you don't pay tax on it, but every other capital gain you do have to pay a tax on it, you see, but not if you sell your house. Nothing equivalent for renters. And then who votes in greater percentages, but higher income people, again, who tend to be homeowners, so, right? And renters don't, and younger people don't in high percentages, and it feeds itself. And the last note, though, is at the bigger level, provincial, federal, first past the post. There's some politician 4 years ago say this is going to be the last first past the post, right? But Justin Trudeau got 39% of the vote, and 50-some% of the seats. But so did Harper. It happened to be 39% of the vote. And then ever since World War II, only one prime minister got 50% of the vote. They generally get about 42%. So we keep putting minority governments in power for 4 years. The parliamentary system, there's no checks and balances. In the United States, there's checks and balances if they want to exercise it. Right now, the Republicans don't want to do it, but if they decide to do it, it happens. You can kick the guy out, right? Well, our backbenchers could revolt if they wanted to, but that doesn't happen. But it was Mulroney and Brian Mulroney in his second election, followed by a total collapse of down to what was it, 2 or 3 or 4 members of parliament. But we keep electing minority governments and giving them a majority power. I'm afraid it's going to continue that way, and it's sad, but yeah. We sometimes do the right thing, though. See, False Creek and St. Lawrence both came about when enough citizens got pissed off, and in 1972, in both cities, far apart and separately, they kicked out most of the council. And it was called a Reform Council, and they decided to do things this way. And right now, you have other councillors who are not doing things that way. The optimistic side of the pessimism is what? Think about the 99% and the 1%. Nobody had heard of that. Apparently it started in Vancouver, right? And over the whole globe, there was a few weeks or months, whatever it was. And some people say, oh, it was a failure in the end. Well, no. nobody denies the rise in income inequality in countries like ours. It's just impossible to deny that. There's still the climate deniers, but I don't believe that they believe themselves, but believe it themselves, but they, because of financial interests or whatever, right? Where did it come from, right? And it had an impact, you know, not huge, but it had certain impacts. And the globalization, was it the battle in Seattle? What year was that? We go back to 99. Where did that come from, right? Totally unanticipated. So those governments have to go meet on a isolated island or someplace to protect them from the people. Okay, they do that. But more and more people are organizing and angry, and frankly in every age group, right? So we won't know when there's a critical mass or something happens where there's enough people that are that angry. But if nobody tries, nothing will happen.